what do you know about worm burden in the industry?
There was evidence leading up to this project that on free-range farms in particular, when they opened up birds, there was a very high prevalence of roundworms, tapeworms. They are the two easiest ones to see, and we're confirming that there's a pretty high prevalence of those in the birds and the flocks that we're looking at. One of the reasons why this project's happening is, and why when you open up these birds in free-range systems, like, yeah, in a cage system, you separate the birds from their excreta, so you completely break the life cycle. In a barn system or an indoors system only, they can come in contact with their excreta, so they can get some worms. And so worms are a problem anytime birds are on the ground. But in a free-range system where they can get out and then they can access intermediate hosts, so that's why the tapeworms come in and become so important, because out there's earthworms and grasshoppers and flies and all these things that can be, there's hundreds and hundreds of tapeworm species that affect birds, and but they all involve an intermediate host, a housed animal. There may be some litter beetles and things and a little bit of transmission, but it all gets much bigger when you go to a free range system.
I know that there's multiple components to this project. Could you just briefly explain to me what they are?
Firstly, we are doing an online survey of producers, just to see, just free range producers, to see what their attitudes to worm control are, how they're controlling worms, whether they think worms are a problem, and that has been completed. The second step of the project is to get out on farms and look at how heavy the parasite burdens are on those farms by basically looking at 100 spent hens and bringing their intestines back to the lab and going through them with a fine-tooth comb, counting parasites. The third step is to determine whether the drugs that are currently registered for use in the poultry industry for controlling worms are doing their job. Some of those drugs are 60-odd years old, and there's anecdotal evidence of failure of anthelmintic treatments out there in the field. And so we're going to do formal anthelmintic resistance testing to see whether the drugs, how efficacious the drugs are against their claims. The fourth method is a whole suite of improved methods aimed at seeing if we can store parasites for a longer period in the laboratory rather than just have them stored in chickens or lose strains that we're working with. Also, methods to improve the diagnostics, to get down to real practical things like if you want to diagnose a worm problem on your farm, what samples should you collect, how many, what types, where do you send them, and how to interpret the results in terms of egg counts. And in the lab, what is the best methodology in the laboratory to deal with those samples. We're also having a look at, can we test anthelmintic resistance in a test tube, basically, instead of having to do it in chickens. And the last part of the project is to put together web pages with a lot of information about worms relevant for industry, maybe some of the findings from this project as well, so that producers have access to up-to-date, accurate information on worms and how to control them in chickens.
What will industry gain from this project?
So I think they will gain an understanding of where the industry is at with parasite control from surveys, both asking producers and physically measuring things on farms. They will have an understanding of and a level of confidence about whether the drugs that are currently available to them are working efficaciously all the time. They will have a resource where they can go to find out information about worms, and potentially they will have clear guidelines about how to diagnose a worm problem and assess whether they actually really have a problem that they need to do something about, or whether they can relax.